Hey there, welcome to 18.1 Taxonomy. We're talking about how we organize living things. What are the categories or the boxes that we put living things into? So let's first talk about the definition of taxonomy. Taxonomy is the science of naming and grouping organisms by their physical characteristics and evolutionary relationships. And so we put animals and bacteria and plants into categories based on how they look and based on their DNA. And so we could say things that have leaves are plants, and things that have mammary glands and fur are mammals, and things that are composed of eukaryotic cells, well, we say that those are in the domain eukarya or eukaryotes. And so we find categories or we create categories based on characteristics that certain things have. And so we put them into taxa or different groups. And there are different levels to these groups. So taxa are the groups, and if you have a single taxa, it's a taxon, hence taxonomy. And so if we look at the groups that we organize them into, we can remember this by saying, dumb King Philip came over for great spaghetti. So D stands for domain. We remember that there are three domains of life: domain eukarya, prokarya, and archaea. And so things that are composed of eukaryotic cells are in the domain eukarya. We know about the kingdoms in domain eukarya. We know that there's plantae, there's animalia, there's fungi, and there's protista. So if you are a single-celled organism that's composed of a eukaryotic cell, well, you're in the domain protista. If you are composed of animal cells and you're multicellular, then you are in the kingdom Animalia. And so phylum, if you have a backbone, you're in the phylum Chordata. Class, order, family, genus, and species. And so the genus and species is important, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. So let's look at the taxonomy of a human. So the domain eukarya. Humans are eukaryotes. We're composed of eukaryotic cells. So in your notes, type eukarya. These things in the brackets, you don't need to type these in. This is just for discussion. And humans, we ingest our food. We're multicellular, and we're composed of eukaryotic cells. So we are animals. If we were composed of eukaryotic cells and we had chloroplasts and we could photosynthesize, then we would be in kingdom Plantae. But we're not. We're heterotrophs. We eat our food. We eat other things to get our energy. Phylum Chordata. We're chordates. We have a backbone, which is our vertebrae. So anything with a vertebrae or with a backbone is going to be a chordate. So your vertebrates, your cats, your dogs, your squirrels, anything with a backbone. Class Mammalia. We are mammals, meaning that we have mammary glands. We produce milk for our young in our mammary glands. We breathe air. And so this is true for all mammals. So your dog is a mammal, your cat is a mammal, your fish is not a mammal. It doesn't breathe air. It doesn't have mammary glands, and so it is not a mammal. However, it is a chordate because it has a backbone. Primates. If you are in the domain Eukarya in kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, class Mammalia, and you have eyes on the front of your head, so if you're a mammal with eyes on the front of your head, then you are a primate. And that is the order that humans are in. We are primates. If you are a primate and you are bipedal, meaning you walk on 2 feet, so pedal is a suffix for feet, and bi is the prefix for 2, so 2 feet. You are bipedal, and you have an opposable thumb, which means you could climb up trees because your thumb can reach and touch your fingers. Then you're in the family Hominidae. Finally, the genus that we are in, meaning homo meaning complex cognitive abilities. And finally, our species is sapien, And so when you put those together, we are Homo sapiens. And so there's only one species, sapiens. Every species has its own species. So every species is just one single type of organism. There's only one Homo sapiens. There's only one Pan-Troglodytes. And so we base a lot of our understanding and where we fall into these categories on common ancestors. And a common ancestor is an organism from which two or more species are directly descended. So if we look at this group of people, we could say that they could potentially be, even though they look different, they could potentially be all related. And this guy could potentially be their great-great-grandfather. So if this guy is all of their great-great-grandfather, then we would say that he is their common ancestor. So to you and your siblings, if you have siblings, your most recent common ancestor is your parents. To your cousins, your most recent common ancestor is your grandparents. And so we share common ancestors with all of life on Earth. At some point in history, we are related to all of life on Earth. We all have the same genetic code. We all share DNA, which is really cool. And so this is how we display the tree of life. This is how we display our common ancestors, and it shows how closely related we are to things. So we can see here there's a human, there's a chimpanzee, there's a mouse, a lizard, a salamander, and a fish. And so by looking at this, we can see that we are more closely related to a mouse than we are to a fish. So if we look here on this cladogram, so this is called a cladogram, and we put a little dot right here. Then here, let me put a little dot right here. So this would be a common ancestor. This represents a common ancestor that gave rise to organisms that have fur and mammary glands, so mammals. So there was a mammal at some point that gave rise to both mice and chimpanzees and humans and all sorts of other organisms that are mammals. And so here we'd say that there was a common ancestor that had lungs. We have a common ancestor. Humans have a common ancestor with a salamander that had lungs. So remember that I'm not saying that humans were once salamanders. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that humans were once had a common ancestor. That common ancestor gave rise to both salamanders and to humans. So there was something that gave rise to both of us, just like we were both related, both you and your sister are related to your parents. All right, let's move on to the next one. Let's talk about humans. We have the taxonomy of humans, of chimps and swans. So we're going to fill in the information for a chimpanzee. Let me get my pen back. We can see that humans, chimps, and swans, they're all composed of eukaryotic cells, so they're in the domain eukarya. They're also all animals, so they're all in the kingdom Animalia. And so here we can put for a chimp that we are animals. And here the phylum, Chordata. Do chimps have backbones? Do swans have backbones? Yes, swans have backbones. And so chimps also have backbones. So we're going to say that they are chordates. I'm just going to write half of the words here. So yes, they're chordates, just like humans. Do chimpanzees have mammary glands? Do they feed their young milk? Do they have fur? Do they breathe air? Yes, they're mammals. So I'm going to write the first three letters, mammals. However, swans do not. So the most recent common ancestor that humans and chimps had with a swan was an organism that had a backbone. So let's move on. So are chimpanzees primates? Do they have eyes on the front of their head? Yes, they do. So let's put that in here, primates. And do they walk on 2 feet? Are they bipedal? Yes, they are. They're hominids. So we have a relatively recent common ancestor with chimpanzees. Our common ancestor with chimpanzees was far more recent than it was with swans. The genus of a chimp, however, is actually Pan. So this is where we start to differentiate. Pan, and this is, you don't need to know how to spell this, it's Pan troglodytes. Troglodytes. Oops. D-Y-T-E-S. Pan troglodytes. And so the genus and species of a chimp is Pan troglodytes. So the more taxa two species have in common, the more recently they had a common ancestor. And so the more recently two species have had a common ancestor means that they are more closely related. So on that cladogram, we would be standing more closely next to the chimp than we would be to the swan. And here we're going to talk about the scientific names of organisms. How do we create a scientific name? Well, we call it the binomial nomenclature. That's a big word, but if we break it down, big words in science are not scary. They're usually just lots of little words put together. So once again, the prefix bi means two. The word nomial means name, to name, and then nomenclature is a word that means naming system, a two-name naming system. So we use the genus and the species to name organisms. So for example, our genus species as humans was Homo sapiens. And so when we write this, notice how this is written in a very specific way. The first letter of the genus, right here, the H, is going to be capitalized. The first letter of the species is going to be lowercase. And then the whole thing is going to be either in italics or underlined. And the reason for this is when you're reading literature and you come across a funny word, you know that if it has this setup, that they're talking about a very specific species. And so this is the binomial nomenclature, or AKA, also known as the scientific name. So let's do a little bit of practice. If we're talking about the swan, let's start with the chimpanzee, what would be the binomial nomenclature for a chimpanzee? If you said Pan troglodytes, then you're correct. If we're talking about the swan, if you said Cygnus olor, then you're correct. That would be the binomial nomenclature, or the scientific name for the swan. And here's our last slide. And luckily it includes something cool like a liger. So what is the definition of a species? A species is something, only two organisms that can reproduce, or only two organisms that are in the same species can interbreed and produce a fertile offspring. So what does this mean? Well, if you have a horse and a horse mating, they can interbreed and produce a baby horse. And that is because they're in the same species. But if you have a horse and a dog, they can't interbreed and produce an offspring. And so therefore, they're in a fertile offspring. And so therefore, they're two different species. There's a weird little exception, though. There are some species that are closely related, and they can produce an offspring, but they're not a fertile offspring. What does this mean? Fertile means able to reproduce. So a horse and a donkey are evolutionarily closely related, closely enough that they can interbreed and produce something called a mule. However, this mule is fertile. It'll never be able to reproduce. It is sterile, so it can't reproduce. And so therefore, a horse and a donkey are two different species. The same thing is true about a lion and a tiger. They're evolutionarily closely related. However, they are not closely related enough to be the same species. They can produce an offspring. The liger, here's a liger right here, they're enormous. However, this liger cannot produce liger offspring. It is sterile. So while the lion and the tiger can produce an offspring, they cannot produce a fertile offspring, and therefore they're two different species. All right, that's it for today. I hope you guys have a great day.